Hello, today we'll be talking about Ashes of Fiery Weather, a book by a local author, Kathleen Donahoe, who happens to be my cousin. And she will be talking about the book, the novel, and how it relates to history, local history, global history in some cases, and how basically we'll be talking about the book and some aspects of it. Now, it should be noted that Kathleen Dano is a member of a firefighting family, but this isn't a novelization of her life or the lives of her relatives. Although there is a lot of aspects of particularly uh, of firefighting that are universal to people who grew up amongst this really special, unique location. But and there are also aspects of individual characters that who which overlap, including just because she grew up in New York City, and the novel itself is is based in New York City, and it's told from the perspective of women who grew up either married to, or the daughters of, or the siblings of firefighters, or in one case became a firefighter herself. Now, in that case, it's based upon a historical example of a woman, Brenda Berkman, I believe her name was, who was the first female member of the FDNY in 1982, I believe, or the early 1980s. And there are a lot of historical historical events that are incorporated into the plot, the multiple plots of this book. Not just for the FDNY itself, but the city and the country. Things like the Vietnam War and the World Trade Center attack, and the aftermath of the devastating aftermath of the World Trade Center massacre in 2001, and the recovery effort by the firefighters. The fact that there were over 300 members of the FDNY, in addition to all the other first responders who were killed that day. The FDNY was completely devastated and for years, and it had not only the physical impact of destroying so many lives of people who were part of this department for decades in some cases, but also the psychological impact and the trauma, which is still permeates through the department to this day. And one of the things in the book in the novel that's interesting is the way certain events serve as touchstones for the characters, even ones that are not widely known among the general public. For example, the Malbone train wreck, which was a train derailment disaster that took place on the Brighton Beach line in Brooklyn in the early part of the 20th century, and it led to the deaths of between 90 and 100 people, and it was a devastating train wreck that actually resulted in multiple prosecutions. It was sort of comparable, I guess, to the Staten Island ferry disaster, even though there were far fewer casualties in that case. And one of the really fascinating parts of creating this work was the research, which Kathleen explained during different interviews, and after the book was published, actually digging into the archives and finding supporting material that would explain what happened almost a century ago, and incorporating this into the plot, into the storyline about women who are a part of the firefighting community, and that's one of the really kind of novel, no pun intended, aspects of this book. The fact that it's told that there's been literature about firefighters and what they experience, and told from the perspective of men who were part of the FDNY. But I think this is the first example of a book told from the perspective of the women who are either part of either firefighters themselves, but for the most part, women who are relating to the firefighting experience through their husbands or their brothers or their fathers. And it's really intricate work because it's told from the perspective, it's a kind of a multi-generational tale told from the perspective of 7 different women who have different relationships to firefighting, but also to each other. It's not simply the focus is not simply on the trauma of this profession, even though there are chapters and which explore the pain that comes from losing someone in a fire, or losing someone on the job, and things like September 11th, or less apocalyptic disasters. In fact, the first chapter opens up um, with Nora O'Reilly describing how she feels when her husband was lost, and having to pick up the pieces when this completely unexpected event occurred. And that's something that people who are who are in, who are in a relationship, or who have a loved one who's involved in the in firefighting, have to grapple with the if not the expectation, but the possibility that that the person they love will die or be severely injured in a tragic event that comes with their job. Even though it's rare relatively, they still have to cope with the possibility that it may happen. And it's it's really interesting the way these events, the way that the historical events are portrayed over the timeline of this novel. Because as I said, it's a multi-generational novel. It's somewhat it reminded me of just from the narrative perspective. It reminded me a little bit of Commonwealth, which is a book by which is a novel by Anne Patchett, told over the course of several generations. And it could get, for someone coming into this, they might find it to be too complex or intricate to follow all of the multiple multiple characters and the multi-generational aspect of it, trying to go from the early 19th century to the mid 20th century to the 21st century. It might be complex, but somehow she manages to keep the narrative thread going. I actually kind of found it amusing when she described how she did this in an interview about the book. And it's kind of interesting because at the front of the book there's actually a family tree, an outline of who the characters will be, so you can actually go back to that if you do get confused about where you are, relatively speaking, in the plot. You can always go back and check it. And she described during this interview using family. I think it was one of these websites that traces your heritage and your ancestors, and in order to construct an outline of what she wanted the novel to look like in terms of the characters. And the patriarch, or the patriarch of this family is Patrick Devlin, and the unit, the company, is the Glory Devlins. So it's named after him. And even though it's told mostly from a female perspective, it's also told from their perspective, how they explained how they relate to the men in their life who are firefighters, and the not just the trauma of that, but also the personal drama, the personal turmoil and challenges they have with their families. For example, there's another important historical event which intersects with the plot is the Spanish influenza epidemic, and it impacts this family incredibly, and actually changes the course of not only their lives but also the lives of their children. And I think that's one of the main main takeaways for me, at least, that certain decisions you have impact not only you, but also have a kind of a ripple effect down through the generations that you're not really even cognizant of unless you go and actually explore and research your family history in order to understand certain things like that. And it's really interesting how through the as I said, the intergenerational or multi-generational rather aspect of it can be very confusing if you normally if you just think of trying to time shift back and forth as you're reading the novel. But I think she does a really superb job of keeping the narrative thread going, so that you're not constantly confused or thrown off by the changes in time as you go through the novel. And as I said, it's not autobiographical, but there are parts of it that do dovetail with.
You have 12 minutes.
Okay, that do dovetail with the life of the author. For example, there's one character who there's one of the younger characters in the third, or I guess in the third generation, is someone who's studying in New York City, and the decisions of young people to go into the city or come back to the city after they were raised in Long Island or outside of New York City, outside of the outer boroughs, to return to where they were born and try to start off their career in New York City. That's something that is based to a large degree in real life. That, and of course the fact that her family was raised in a firefighting family. My cousin, one of my cousins, is a firefighter, and his father was a firefighter for decades before he retired And Kathleen's father was a firefighter for ages before he decided to retire. So I think the fact that she has firsthand experience, I mean, in addition to being a very proficient and talented writer, the fact that she has firsthand experience and knowledge of the history of the fire department from her own parents is really adds to the authenticity, and really adds to the authenticity of the novel. Now, the title itself is kind of, for people who might not be familiar with it, is kind of perplexing, but it comes from I believe it comes from a Dylan Thomas poem, uh, which isn't in the book, but oh, I'm sorry, not Dylan, Wallace Stevens. It comes from a Wallace Stevens poem. These are the ashes of fiery weather, of nights full of the green stars from Ireland, wet out of the sea and luminously wet like beautiful and abandoned refugees. Now, another very prominent, inescapable part of this book is the Irish heritage of the characters and the connection to Ireland. And in fact, some of the characters actually are from Ireland. Of course, the later generations are the children and the grandchildren of people who grew up in Ireland, but the patriarch was and his wife, the two kind of this the seeds of this family were from Ireland, and of course the FDNY. One of the most distinctive parts about it is the Irish heritage of so many of the members, so many of the firefighters, and to the point that the bagpipers are one of the calling cards for people who don't know, who might not know much about the FDNY or its history. They know the pipers, the fife, the bagpipers. So that's another aspect of this book, the relationship between Ireland and New York City, and of course most of the people who became firefighters, I think, in previous generations were Irish, because it was one of the fields that was relatively unencumbered by any sort of discrimination towards people from Ireland who could also speak English and were able to become kind of the fulcrum of what became the FDNY. And you just noticed by the names of the characters, the Jack Keegan and Annie Rose Devlin Keegan, Delia Keegan O'Reilly, um, Katie Rourke McKenna. They're all Irish names, and I think that was this 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 was a fitting first debut novel for Kathleen Donahoe, because it, even though it's not a novelization of her life or her family's life, and there aren't that many autobiographical details, it does have a kind of wide panoramic view of growing up in New York City, growing up in New York, and being a part of a tradition, a firefighting tradition that is a historical legacy that's embedded with her family. And I think the fact that it's told from the perspective of women, one of whom, as I said in the book, is kind of modeled after a real historical figure who
3 more minutes.
broke ground and became a pioneer as the first female member of the FDNY. It's I think it's just an interesting and very very special. I think it's just a very, very special book, and like I said, that's, even as, regardless, it's a well written, just very engrossing story, but it's also an interesting story in the sense that it's something that is relatively new, perspective that hasn't been seen. Even though we know, we've heard what being a firefighter is like, or at least I've had it portrayed in literature and film. The idea of having a multi-generational family story and exploring the relationships of women with each other and with the men they know and they love, who are part of this kind of amazing network of brothers, is really, it's really an interesting and unique perspective. So I would definitely recommend, if you want to look for a very good popular novel, I would definitely check out Ashes of Fiery Weather. It's really for people who appreciate literature and appreciate New York and Ireland and firefighting. They're going to appreciate this book. But even if you are not, even if you're not very intensely interested in those subjects, it's still a very incredibly well-written, engrossing debut novel. So